Good evening, and welcome to Screentone Club, episode 44. We are recording this on the 9th of February 2020 for release on the 18th of February 2020. We've managed to get ahead of ourselves, which, is quite nice for having a buffer and all that malarkey. This is your fortnightly look at manga with a focus on drink discussion. My name is Elliot Page, and I'm joined as always by my lovely co-host, Mr. Andy Hanley. How you doing, Andy?
Yes, I'm doing very well. Surviving the storms, which will feel like a really dated reference by the time we publish this podcast, but it's real windy right now.
Yeah, it's kind of wild. I woke up this morning at 5 a.m. due to wind lashing against my windows, which was actually quite pleasant. It was like one of those like noise apps on your phone, but for real. But then I couldn't get to sleep, so I woke up and made myself pancakes. So...
Yeah, that's always a good solution to those things.
It turned out it really was. Also, it's one of these things where you think, I'm an adult, I can do what I like make pancakes at 5:30 in the morning. Dear me. Hey, whatever. Judge me if you want. But this is as mentioned, your fortnightly look at manga. We have, much like every podcast, we have a Patreon, which we hope you'll consider if you do like this show. Any support really helps keep us going. It helps pay for the oodles of manga we buy for this podcast. And also, we are quite close to our next stretch goal of then releasing 2 bonus episodes a month. We currently release 1 bonus episode a month, which you only get if you're a member of the Patreon. You only have to sign up for $1, unlike every other Patreon under the sun for a podcast, which demands $5 from you. So hey, cash in on our cheapskatedness, I suppose. But you'll also get the previous year plus of bonus podcasts as well. Not just new ones. Also on the Patreon bent is Mr. Rob Jessup. Thank you very much for supporting us as always. So, moving on to the main part of the show. We have returning champions, and I may cut this down because I kind of have spooled off in a wild direction. Do you mind if I take first stab, Andy?
Yeah, go for it.
I mean, readily, 2 of these I'm going to do right now are catch-ups for stuff that you've already caught up on yourself. First would be Kaiju Girl Caremelise, which I've been told by a friend who does not read manga, but they were like, damn, that's a good title. And I'm like, hell yeah, it is. Anyway, Kaiju Girl Caremelise, I think, I don't want to put words in your mouth, Andy. I do that enough anyway. But this was surprisingly affecting, honestly. I think you mentioned the same, when you read this volume previously. But as Kuro tries to become more comfortable with herself and with her hot crush, whose name I have forgotten. Whoops. Pretty Boy McPretty Boy. But they go on a date, and that's the majority of this volume, is the 2 of them trying to survive a rather fraught date and getting wires crossed, and both of them thinking that they're a pain to the other one. Very familiar feelings myself. And it gets really kind of fraught and quite saddening at some points, mostly because it just seems so close to disaster. And there are so many things without, not just the kaiju transformation thing, but even just normal human crossed wires and everything else getting in the way of the pair. And of course, Harugon, the giant kaiju form, appearing again. And it kind of hit me, honestly. You have Kuro's best friend, who is the kaiju maniac girl, who makes a triumphant return in this volume, and her quote unquote dad uncle, I don't know, her fellow metalhead, I suppose. But yeah, a whole bunch of stuff happens in this volume, and honestly, more than anything, I was just kind of shocked about how much it affected me and how bad I felt for the whole cast. It's man, I really care about these characters now. This manga did a good job. I don't know. I think I don't want to put words in your mouth, but was that kind of matching your feelings, Andy?
Yeah, very, very much so. For a series that is quite kind of light-hearted in certain ways, and obviously has a kind of comedy bent to it. It really hits hard. That second volume in particular, I think, because you've kind of built up that sort of relationship with Kuro, kind of watching her struggling with stuff, and it seems like, hey, this could be it. She's finally got her break. She's getting a date with this boy that she's interested in. This should be great. This should be a fantastic kind of standout moment in her life thus far, and that's adorable. And then just watching it all kind of fall apart, and kind of feeling that the powerlessness when that kind of happens in that sort of situation, because again, one thing this series does so well is to have the whole kind of kaiju transformation as kind of, an allegory for sort of, her puberty and her anxiety and all of these kind of like hormones and emotions that are raging within her. And I think it's just a feeling that this is completely, like, as hard as she tries, this is kind of beyond her control, and like she can't really do anything about this. It's just kind of heartbreaking, like watching all of that pan out.
Yeah.
And it does really have an impact as a result of that.
Yeah, it's a lot, and it works really well, quite frankly. Of course, I'm now back in the position of jonesing for Volume 3, which God knows when that's coming out. But yeah, this is, as I say, a surprisingly affecting story. Also, more Primo Jumbo King content, your local idiot dog. I love that name. I love that dog. So dumb. And so my second returning champion is a rather belated entry. It's My Solo Exchange Diary Volume 2, which you talked about previously, Andy. And at the risk of being slightly glib, my summed up sort of response to this volume is a long, drawn out oof. Mostly because it's really intense. Like, Nagata Kabi has always been one to sublimate their struggles into their art, and in particular this story. But it also becomes really apparent that things are moving so fast and so horribly at multiple times in this volume that, she will actually mention to herself, like, oh, I think my art's gotten worse. And you'll look at it and go, yeah, actually, this has gotten pretty weird. And the whole thing kind of oscillates wildly. And by the end of the volume, I was kind of glad that, one of the final parts of the volume is the author apologizing and saying, I'm sorry, I have to end this. This is not helping and it's hurting a lot of people. The first volume of this came out and oh dear. So it's kind of a fascinating and kind of like complete ringer of a volume, honestly, just because it feels like a lot of things just dumping down on the already somewhat benighted character / author. So yeah, a real heavy one, this. I mean, Volume 1 and My Lesbian Experience in Loneliness were not light fare for sure, but holy cow, this is a read. I mean, it's fascinating. It's absolutely fascinating, and it continues to have the same sort of utter like seamlessness when it comes to explanations and visualization, but it's a much harder read to get through, honestly. And it touches on, like, we now know that Nagata Kabi's next work is going to be like a greater expansion on one section of this story, which is when she gets checked into a clinic for alcoholism and depression. And like, that was already really intense in this volume, and having that broken out into a larger story already seems kind of exhausting. Like, thinking about it is making me sweat, honestly, because it's like, oh god, I hope the author's okay. I mean, she posted a very nice tweet on her Twitter feed saying thank you to my overseas fans, which is lovely. But yeah, it's a real doozy of a volume, honestly, like somehow even more intense than the previous.
Yeah. And again, I think it's one of those things where you become, and even more so knowing that, it is autobiographical, like you very much become invested in the author and their well-being, and like, again, that leap between Volume 1 and Volume 2 where it's like, okay, there's some bad stuff that's happened, but there's a light at the end of the tunnel here, and then kind of watching that light kind of seemingly get blocked off is really hard to read. Like, it's incredibly good and important, like much like her previous volumes, but yeah, like you need to steel yourself and be prepared to read that one.
Totally. At some point, even, you feel like part of the problem at multiple points in that volume where you're thinking, man, if she didn't have to write this, like, it's not just for me, but if she didn't have to write this for me, wouldn't everything be better? Like, and I think, as mentioned, Kabi kind of comes to that realization herself towards the end and gives that as the reason for ending it, which, hey, that's good. Because, even so, it's not a complete down. I mean, there's like, she meets up with a friend who gives her a hug, and it's like, oh, this was the most important thing to me. And it's like, yep, that makes sense. Totally get you. So yeah, woof. Still can't wait to see their next work. I hope they're okay. Holy shit. Please be safe, Nagata Kabi.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, like very, very much interested to see what comes next, especially given what you've just mentioned about the kind of, clinic for alcoholism, etc. Because again, one thing that I've kind of said multiple times about her now is like, she has a great ability to explain things that are not kind of, my personal lived experiences in a way that helps me to understand them. And I think kind of addiction is definitely another thing that could benefit greatly from kind of like her insight and her ability to explain things. Because again, it's one of those things that has so much stigma around it of like, well, this is your own fault, why don't you just stop, etc., all of that stuff. And hopefully like it'll be a really kind of instructive work if she really manages to kind of keep up her cadence of making this stuff kind of understandable and really kind of getting into the whole thing in a way that is engaging.
Yeah, totally. I mean, in this volume, she talks about going into and leaving the clinic itself, and it's not a simple thing of go to clinic, leave clinic. It's a whole thing taking place over several chapters and several months of life. And all of it, you can kind of, forgive my use of the phrase, but totally grok every stage of it of, oh yeah, of course, this isn't going to be easy, is it? At any point. And yeah, it's a lot to read through because as you say, it works really well at imparting that to you, not just telling you, but like giving it unto you, I suppose, to be a bit highfalutin, I suppose. But I think that kind of matches what you were saying, Andy. So, but yeah, it's a real gift. It's just that I wish that she didn't have to go through so much grief. Like, holy cow.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think at this point we're all hoping that at some point it's going to be like, hey, my next work is going to be about like my happy life and how great everything is. Cause like she absolutely deserves it at this point.
Totally. So, I'm going to cut my last returning champion in the interest of time and also to save it up for next episode. But Andy, you have another returning champion on here. Do you want to take the lead?
Yeah, so having talked about volume 1 of it last episode, I have read volumes 2 and 3 of If I Could Reach You, which is the Yuri drama romance series that I think we both kind of had like mixed feelings on in some slightly different ways. But my main takeaway that I kind of mentioned at the time was that I was very much invested in the main character Uta, and I kind of wanted to see like where she was headed with her kind of unrequited and kind of impossible love. So in the kind of week following recording that show, I just the itchy trigger finger to hit the buy button just got too great, and I ended up picking up the remaining 2 volumes. And volumes 2 and 3 are both still kind of mixed bags. I will say that right from the off. On the positive side, there are a couple of major things, actually. One of which is that the series actually starts to dig into some of the other characters and their kind of internality. Specifically, like volume 2 actually starts with kind of an inner monologue from Karu, who is the girl who is married to Uta's brother and who Uta is in love with.
Excellent.
And it's really interesting because all of volume 1 is kind of about Uta, kind of feeling like, the spare wheel in this relationship, in this family that has kind of, been brought together. And she feels, over and above almost her kind of like, her romantic interest is just this feeling that, I'm kind of the nuisance here. Like, it would be better if I wasn't around. And the interesting thing is that volume 2 kind of like switches the focus for a bit to Karu, who is having basically exactly the same dilemma. Like from her perspective, like she's muscled in on this brother and sister and she's muscled in on this family. And she feels really kind of uncomfortable with that. And she kind of feels like the interloper in this situation. And these volumes do kind of hint a little bit more about Uta's kind of family, about her parents, etc. It doesn't really dig too deep into it, but it does kind of also reinforce kind of Karu's discomfort that she feels like she's still an outsider despite, being kind of married to Ray, etc. So that's kind of an interesting perspective that continues through these 2 volumes. Like Karu, we spend a lot more time with her and kind of inside her head, which is quite interesting to see. Perhaps the more interesting part actually is that Killer gets some decent time in play as well.
Awesome.
I kind of assumed that she was just going to be the shoulder to cry and kind of sidekick character that would just crop up to kind of, admonish Uta for being an idiot over and over again.
The emotional punching bag, as she mentions herself in the first volume.
Exactly. But she actually has her own thing going on, and it's a really interesting kind of angle on kind of romance and relationships that, you know, I won't go into and spoil, but it kind of, it surprised me because I don't think it's something that I've particularly seen in any kind of story like this before. But like, she has a very particular take on like what she wants from a relationship. And there's a whole kind of like, you know, story arc around that throughout these 2 volumes it's just really interesting. It's something kind of a bit fresh and unique. And it kind of, you know, gives some of the other characters something to think about as well. So all of that stuff is really good. The series continues to be incredibly good at its kind of inner monologues and at exploring the characters and their kind of internal feelings and what they're thinking about. Like, Uta, again, has some fantastic moments where she kind of, you know, mulls over kind of where she's at and what she's tried to do versus what's actually happened and so on and so forth. There's some really great kind of well written and clearly sort of well translated sort of thoughts and opinions about kind of like, you know, how she's feeling and so on and so forth. And all of that is really strong. And I do really enjoy all of that stuff. And that's kind of, I think, what kept me coming back for these subsequent volumes, because that was the kind of stuff I really enjoyed. On the flip side of it, I think my biggest problem with these volumes is that I was kind of hoping that this series wouldn't feel like it needed to reach for the low-hanging fruit of kind of kitchen sink drama. And it does in these volumes. Like, volume 2 basically goes for perhaps the most cliched bit of kind of melodrama it could possibly pull out to try and kind of change the dynamics between some of the characters. And I mean, it kind of works for what it is, but like, it's just a really disappointingly kind of, you know, it's just playing the softball option when I'm sure there are plenty of more kind of interesting ways they could have written kind of a shift in some of these relationships, but instead it just goes for the easy kind of nuclear option of just, you know, here's an easy way to flip the table and just shake everybody up. And that's kind of a bit disappointing. It then also kind of leads into some of the typical kind of like characters, you know, not saying what they know or not saying what they're thinking or feeling, just to kind of keep these things up in the air when actually, you know, they could be brought down in some shape or form if people were to actually just like verbalize what they're saying. So that whole kind of point is kind of frustrating. But yeah, I don't know, like I still kind of broadly enjoy the series, and the stuff that it does really well. Like, it's just, there are other elements to it that you kind of look at and just feel like I just wish it had a little bit more to it, or it just kind of, you know, put in a bit more effort really to try and kind of mark itself out from the crowd in ways where it just goes for the cliche option.
So yeah, it almost sounds like the series is doing well when it's not having to try and satisfy these like drama gods, but then it feels like it has to be a romance manga, and then, as you say, pulls the nuclear option. So that sounds kind of annoying in a way of like, oh, you know, you were working quite well with an interesting payload of tension and drama and romantic sort of dilemmas, and then you do something stupid because you feel like you have to, and that upsets the apple cart because you were doing so much better at the other sort of stuff that's understated because it's difficult to do. I don't know, like, almost like, does that make sense, or am I kind of gabbing there?
Yeah, no, I think that's pretty much it. Like, you can see why it's going for the options it is. It just feels like for a series that is written with a certain amount of kind of nuance and kind of, you know, some broad perspectives above and beyond the usual kind of, you know, romantic drama fare. Like, it just always feels disappointing when it goes for the obvious option. And, you know, when that is such a major part of these volumes in particular, you know, it's just not that satisfying, basically. Yeah,
I mean, you had that character, I forget her name, but you had that secondary character in the first volume who was like known for her sexual exploits almost, but it managed to handle her in a rather even-handed fashion. And so, like, the ability, it's kind of one of these bizarre things where it's able to handle that very well and then seems to lose confidence in itself and do something really base.
Yeah, and on which note, that character basically kind of vanishes out of these 2 volumes. Like, she crops up at one point just to be like, hey, yeah, it's me, I'm still having a good time, I'm still sleeping around, and then that's basically it. That's effectively their moment over these 2 volumes. And again, I hope that's a character that they're planning to go back to, but it feels very much like somebody that got introduced and then kind of sidelined for other things at this point, because they're just there as kind of like token girl who seems to be doing okay but still has her own thing going on.
Yeah, that's a massive shame, honestly, because it seemed that they all, again, this is me maybe prescribing too much, but it seems like the author accidentally hit like a rich vein of gold and was like, oh no, I can't, like I have to step back from this because I've got the actual rest of the series to plan out. I mean, even with all of that being said, I am now curious and probably will pick this up just to see where it goes, because at the very minimum, I'm interested in seeing Kaoru's side of it, and the more wrinkles in this story, the better, rather than just Uta no Daiboken, anxious, a go-go. Because that would be far too boring. But at the same time, it's like you've already managed to carve yourself out a niche of being unique in this, and then you decide to do, generic drama stuff. So we'll see. I don't know. It sounds like I'm already going to annoy myself, but I want to read these volumes now. So, welp.
Yeah, like for me, there isn't enough good to it that, when the fourth volume comes out, I will doubtless be picking it up. And so, I don't want to be kind of overly harsh on it, because I think it does do a lot of good things, but in a way, that's also what hamstrings it when it does the more disappointing stuff, because it just feels all the more out of place.
Oh, totally. Okay, cool. With that out of the way, we're going to move on to the main part of the show. Do you mind if I go ahead first, Andy?
No, please do.
So my pick is a whole thing, really. So my pick was H.P. Lovecraft's At the Mountains of Madness, Volume 1, which is an adaptation of the H.P. Lovecraft novella. I think it's novella. It's kind of longer than his normal stuff. The novella At the Mountains of Madness, which was written around 1930 towards the end of his and peak of his career, where H.P. Lovecraft being one of the luminaries of kind of sci-fi and what's better known as cosmic horror, and kind of, the whole Cthulhu mythos, and trailblazed that particular sort of element. He was highly inspired by Edgar Allan Poe, which, if you go back to read Edgar Allan Poe, seems extremely base, because everyone has developed past him and kind of elaborated very much on what he kind of pioneered. Anyway, I was deeply into Lovecraft when I was like 16, 17. I read all of his stuff. I collected all the books I could. I kind of read all of it and found it all deeply fascinating, because H.P. Lovecraft himself is a colossal racist and a complete prick, but had some really interesting sort of ideas in his writing, even the racist ones. I was about to give an example, but that would be, I don't want to say the words, frankly. So as a quick sort of thing, I have previously read the novella this is based on, and know it kind of well enough. I still have it in my head. I've read it a few times. Andy, have you ever read any of Lovecraft's stuff, or are you otherwise au fait with the Lovecraft mythos overall?
No, I've not read any of his stuff, so this is all kind of new to me.
Okay, I am really fascinated to hear what you think then. But so as I'm the one driving, I'll give the quick intro. So this is, as mentioned, a 2-volume adaptation of At the Mountains of Madness, kind of at the peak of his power, as mentioned. The author is Go Tanabe, who previously did the horror manga Kasane, which I have volume 1 of, and I kind of noped the hell out on because it kind of freaked me out. Go Tanabe has won an Eisner for a previous Lovecraft anthology, which was The Hound and Other Stories, another utterly freaky story. They're currently going through and doing a lot of these very lavish presentations of Lovecraft stories, so I think they've hit a little bit of a mine of precious metal. It's being published by Dark Horse, and it comes in 2 volumes, so this is the first half, and it comes in very lavish physical or digital editions. It feels like a real labor of love, this product, because it has a lot of external to the actual manga itself elements. It has an introduction to Lovecraft and the Mountains of Madness. It has some really lovely editing and presentation. The editor on this is Carl Gustav Horn, who I hold in extremely high regard because he does a lot of really good work, and it shows, which, if anything, kind of feels a bit weird at the start when it starts quoting Edgar Allan Poe, and I'm like, hey, knock it off. Get to the Lovecraft bit. So it's complete at 2 volumes. You can get both of them online, or you can get them physically. The physical size of it will be nice. But basically, the story covers Dr. Dyer, who is a geologist who, in 1930, is part of the Miskatonic University, which is a Lovecraft staple, in Arkham, New England, I believe, sort of Boston area, America. And this is, again, very Lovecraft sort of stuff, and it draws on a lot of his previous elements. which are dropped deliberately around like sweets. But basically, they're flying in 1930 to the South Pole to chart it, take measurements, do some drilling, see what's out there, just to kind of explore it, because it's still kind of an unknown continent. Technology has started to really advance. Like, they now have a portable gas-powered drill. They have lightweight aircraft they can use to survey, and they have furs and other materials which will help them like weather the terrible conditions of the Antarctic. And so they go down there on a rather weird-looking ship, and it's mostly... The main characters in this are Dyer and one of his colleagues, Lake, who is a biologist, who is brought along and feels like the odd one out, because everyone else is like an engineer or a geologist or whatever, but he's there for biology, and he's like, well, who knows what we might find. So basically, this entire story is the rather long expedition, like notes of the expedition. The first chapter, the introductory chapter, with a late title card which owns, is basically ground zero at Lake's base camp after they go missing during the trip, and Dr. Dyer then filling in the background of what has happened to lead up to that point. And basically the first volume ends slightly after the time points converge and the medias res is resolved. The original novella, it's worth noting, was written past tense by Dyer's point of view of him warning people away from the Antarctic, and he kind of starts, and they kind of slightly move that preface back in the timeline to have it be focused on Lake's camp rather than Dyer being safe and sound back in Arkham. And so so basically what happens, in a long story short, is that they do some digging, they find some geological strata that's pre-Cambrian, and it has biological materials in, which should be impossible because that's before the evolution of life on Earth. What's going on? Lake gets kind of obsessed, to cut it quite short, and he decides to mount an expedition towards these rather scary, dark, black-peaked mountains. He even does a title drop about page 200 of The Mountains of Madness, which had me clapping in the cafe because I love cheesy crap like that, although I hate it. And basically, Lake gets in way too deep, and that's where the story kind of goes from there, of Lake getting himself in deep trouble and then Dyer flying in to try and pick up the pieces. So yeah, I really, really love this series, this presentation. The visuals are astounding. It has some real amazing 2-page spreads, which are absolutely absurd in detail. It's a horror manga. It's a cosmic sci-fi horror, and even the mundanity of Antarctic is utterly terrifying in this volume. Like, ice formations look malevolent and kind of disgusting and terrifying. Even like a lot of attempts are kind of precarious. The scientist team know they could be in very deep crap, and they're trying to keep themselves as calm and collected and stiff upper lippy as possible. One thing about Lovecraft in particular is one of the hallmarks of cosmic horror is that it never explains the problem. It never describes the alien thing that is found, but kind of throws out some rather crazy terminology like cyclopean and stuff like that, and hopes your imagination can fill in the rest. So Go Tanabe has a really intense remit for this, which is drawing and actually showing the indescribable horror. Like, it's said as being indescribable in the book. Like, the book does not explain the anything weird, but Go Tanabe does an amazing job of doing that, of actually showing the uncanny, horrible elements of this, whether it's the mountains, the scenery, the Shoggoths they find, the hidden city, like all this stuff. And it's really impressive to me as well. Even as someone who knows exactly what's happening, is like, man, like, this drawing is intense. And the characters, like themselves, Dyer in particular and his lovely assistant and everyone else, like, you can see that, desperately trying to keep things together, while whatever the hell is going on to them. And it has an amazing pace to it of, there are so many points in this manga that you want to scream at the page and just go, no, stop, like, turn back, you can still live, turn back now, just leave, you'll be fine, just leave. And, they pass through so many different points of no return that you kind of start to go slightly mad yourself reading it. So yeah, I love it dearly. I think it's an amazing presentation of the original novella. I think it looks gorgeous and really enjoyed my every minute with it, honestly. It really kind of brought back my like giddy childhood reading and discovery of this material. But that's my sort of admittedly slightly fanboyish take on it. But Andy, as someone who hasn't read the original thing, I would love to hear what you think.
Yeah, I mean, I really loved it as well. I mean, I think that the first thing to say, like the first thing that kind of jumped out at me is in terms of its presentation and visual style, it didn't really feel like a manga. Like it doesn't really hit any of the kind of typical things that you would maybe kind of, have as a bullet point list of things that makes something look like a manga. Like the character designs, like say a lot of its artwork kind of feels like a step away from that. Like it feels like a far more kind of traditional graphic novel. And like that's absolutely in no way kind of a criticism. But it is just kind of, I think it actually really lends itself to the work as a result of that. Like it could so easily have kind of, lent some more on some of the kind of tent poles of maybe what you'd expect this kind of work to look like, but it really doesn't at all. Like it very much feels like its own thing.
Yeah, one thing I think it reminds me of is like old pulp covers. Like it feels like an extremely high detail and high, budget, sort of version of those old sort of like 30s or whatever pulp cover stories. Like, the actual sort of books that Lovecraft stories themselves were published in at the time and serialized, like with a lot of the sort of very intense paneling and such, and especially the characters staring directly into the panel right at you, the reader, which, still unsettling.
Yeah, I mean, actually, out of interest, did you read this in physical form or did you buy it digitally?
I bought it digitally. Not to tangent too much, but the 2-page spreads were presented as a single image, which really hogged up my tablet. So I had to do a bit of zooming in and out.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if this is more a thing with my tablet, but I felt like this was a book that I kind of came away thinking like, man, I wish I actually had this in print on paper, because honestly, like, it felt like I was losing something, like reading a digitized version of it. Like whether it's just the quality of the transfer or just, just the vagaries of kind of, digital platforms, even above and beyond those 2-page spreads, there were multiple points where it felt like, I feel like this actually looks better than what I'm seeing. And it's not very often that I feel that when I'm reading something on a tablet. I mean, The Girl from the Other Side has that occasionally. I think especially very dark scenes maybe don't always come across very well on digital platforms, but like this was definitely one where I kind of felt like I bet the physical version is actually a better reading experience in terms of its visual quality than this.
Yeah, I can see that totally. I mean, I actually broke one of my personal rules or like predilections for this and actually read it using guided view in Comixology, which I usually detest, frankly. I hate guided view, but it worked really well for this manga because it allowed me to actually get more of the single panels. But as I say, when it got to the 2-page spreads, my tablet could barely keep up. But that, I mean, it is 300 DPI, but even so, it's a lot. There's a lot on the page, and the physical books themselves are a jumbo size, so you're getting your money's worth in paper. So, and I feel like the extra square inchage that's a bad way of phrasing it. The extra sort of actual page size would really do it justice. So yeah, I can buy that, honestly. I mean, the one thing for me is that the digital editions were £7 each. I bought the second one after I read this. Haven't read it yet. But it's a question for me, especially of space. Like I've complained about it endlessly, but I just don't have space for physical manga anymore.
Yeah, for sure.
But no, totally. If you have the ability, I would recommend the physical, because the artwork is ridiculous. Like I was kind of blown away with it, especially like. Sorry, Andy, I'll cede the floor again. But even facial shot number 600 of one of the characters looking perturbed, you think it'd get boring, but it manages to look fresh every time, which is somehow kind of an astounding feat, really.
Yeah. I mean, one of my kind of concerns, quote unquote, when I picked this up was the size of the volume in terms of page count. It's like, oh man, I may not have kind of given myself enough time to read this, but it is very much a page turner, and the cadence of the story is just absolutely spot on. The way it builds its drama and its tension, because it's one of those things, if you actually kind of pull it apart in terms of, how much actually happens across the kind of 260 odd pages. There's not a massive amount of kind of big bullet point. I mean, I didn't actually make a lot of notes for this, and this was partly because there aren't many kind of really massive, these are important kind of inflection points in the story that I'm going to need to remember. But what is there is played out in such a kind of, in just such an interesting way, and just with just the right pacing, so that there's always a progression. There's always a feeling that, we're moving on to something else. And the way that kind of ramps up the tension and kind of, again, mixed with the visuals, the unsettling feeling that, and again, well, a bit like I'm torn on that I'll come back to with that, but like the way it kind of ramps that up very slowly but deliberately is just like absolutely spot on. Like it never really misses a beat in terms of getting that pacing absolutely right.
Yeah, I feel like, again, speaking as someone who has read the original novella, but I feel like it really lays out the calm elements of the story as well as the supernatural, weird, cosmic horror elements. Like, it makes it clear that, you know, there is a normality for these characters. It isn't just crazy shit constantly, ha ha ha. And they're all sensible people. They're all like leaders in their fields, so they're all quite grounded. Some magnificent facial hair on display. But it really sells that they're there to do an actual thing, not just be characters in a story that's going to unfold to them. Like, they're there to do some damn work, and then everything goes quite wrong.
Yeah. And I think that is one of the kind of the fascinating things about reading this is, I think it would be easy to sit there and say, like, I've seen this kind of story play out 1,000 times before. And I think this is very much one of those cases where kind of this is actually sort of one of the stories that is probably why this kind of tale, you know, keeps cropping up in pop culture. Like, you know, in media in general, like, you know, you think of something like the initial kind of Alien films, you know, they very much have a very similar cadence of, you know, it's people going about what should be some kind of ordinary business, something malevolent and unseen happens, and it slowly kind of unravels what is going on, etc., etc. Like, it's kind of, in 2020, this isn't a new, fresh story at all, and I think that kind of, that makes me all the more positive about the fact that this works so well, because it would be so easy for this to just feel like outdated and like, oh yeah, I've seen so many better versions of this kind of story, you know, whether it's the X-Files or whatever, but I can't really think of many that do it quite as well as this. Like, this is definitely in kind of the top tier of this kind of narrative and the way it unfolds.
Yeah, totally. I think it really sells the actual active parts of the story. Like, as I say, like, there are so many moments when you just want to yell at the cast and like demand they leave immediately, because like they're soldiering on, they're doing okay, like they're not happy, but they're getting on with their job, and it's like, you just leave. Like, oh god, like this is terrible. But as you say, it's, as you mentioned, it is kind of one of these things where some of the reveals are quite mundane, especially compared to where culture has kind of gone or stories have developed from this sort of archetype. But it sells it really well through, especially pacing and just the character work of just grounding these characters. And frankly, you know, they're all quite boring ass dudes, and because they're all dudes, but they're up against something so unnatural that it really works in that way.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the one thing that I kind of found myself kind of going back and forth on a little bit.
Yeah, I want to hear what this is. Honestly, I couldn't think of a way to demand you tell me.
Yeah, it's kind of the way that it sets up so much of kind of like the bad thing has happened in its first chapter before then going back to the start. Like, there's part of me that actually really likes that and think that perhaps it adds something to kind of, you know, watching the rest of this volume play out. And there's also part of me that kind of wonders, like, would this be an even more kind of edge of your seat compelling story if you didn't have that first chapter of like, hey, look, people have gone missing, here's all this weird shit. Like, I find myself kind of vacillating on, like, was that the best way to start it? Or is that, like, would it actually have had even more power if it didn't have that? And I'm genuinely not sure, but it's something that I've been kind of like tossing around in my head ever since I read it.
Yeah, I have to admit, this is probably more a sign of me being a big dum-dum. But when that happened, I got really confused because I got really confused and thought it was strictly linear rather than in medias res. So it was a case of, so they're back in Boston now? What's going on? And I had to then go back and compare the timestamps because it has the whole like X date, Y year thing. And I had to reread that and go, wait, was this an in medias res thing? Oh, it was. Shit. I think the first chapter could do the whole like we found Lake's camp thing, but I think they showed too much. Like, some of the stuff it shows in the very first like prologue chapter is a little too much for my mind, because it shows you some of the core elements of the horror. Whereas even in the original story, although it was written completely past tense, and Dyer was known to have survived the entire trip and was telling you about the trip, like the intro was like, oh, I survived, and here's why you should never go to the Antarctic ever, ever, ever. Whereas in this, you get face to face with some of the more disgusting elements, I suppose, of the horror, although without context right at the start, and it really blunts the impact later. There's like that, the tent with the there's a bit with a tent, which I'm not going to mention because it's both gross and I don't want to make anyone I want that to leave that as a surprise. But there is a moment where it's like, oh, you didn't need to show that, because later on when it crops up again, you're like, oh yeah, I saw this at the start. So some of the stuff, rediscovering it a second time in actual time flow, like the actual pace of the story, makes it a bit blunted. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. It's like there's part of me that feels like knowing that that's how it ends just kind of adds to the tension of it's kind of almost like a sort of a jump scare in a weird sort of elongated way where something is coming, and the tension of knowing that it's coming just like accentuates it. But there is also very much that point of view of just like, this would be really shocking if I didn't know what was going to happen, and then then it suddenly all kind of pans out before you. But I think I'm very much kind of I can go either way on that, and I think there's probably a little bit of truth to both of those options.
Yeah, I think it definitely helps with sort of because initially I was kind of a bit, because initially I was a bit put off by Lake because I thought, oh man, he's the guy who gets in too deep, yada yada. But then as it continues, you're like, oh no, he's not just being a pillock, or he's being, he doesn't have the luxury of being mind controlled or anything. He actually just gets in too deep and doesn't know when to stop.
Well, I think actually he's also kind of interesting as a character because, I mean, again, from sort of the decades of similar stories being told kind of, subsequent to this, the usual cadence is that the guy that gets into all the trouble gets ridiculously obsessive to the point where he's risking people's lives to the extreme. Whereas in this occasion, like there's a certain amount of that, but there is also a very clear kind of train of humanity of like, okay, no, we need to stop and rest now. Like it's not an all-consuming thing, but it's enough to kind of to drive things forward. And I think it just gets that balance just right in a way that never takes it kind of OTT.
Yeah, I came away from it mostly just feeling extremely bad for Gedney, his assistant, because man, that guy was doing his best and was also in for a penny, in for a pound with the whole thing. And man, we don't even know where he's gone now. Like, God knows where that poor bastard is. But yeah, as I say, like, I oscillate as well on it and I think that, showing that something will happen to Lake is fine, but showing that what happens to the camp in the first chapter feels a bit much. But yeah, it's it's a decision made on part of the adaptation, and that's what it is, an adaptation. So who knows? I'm not an author. I'm not a manga author.
Yeah.
So
yeah, like I can absolutely see why that was the choice that was made. Like I say, I think that there is an element of that works and probably helps it, but there's definitely also a side that hinders it. But thankfully not too much though. Like, it is still a fantastic read. It is kind of visually very striking, and it is absolutely kind of a page turner, which actually leads me to ask, like, is volume 2 the rest of it, or are there more volumes? Okay.
Yeah, it's 2 volumes. That's it. And at this point, like, I think it's kind of, I'm interested. I mean, if you do pick up volume 2, I'll be really interested again to hear what you think, because at this point it's all unknown. Like, you won't get like a first chapter tease of what happens later. It's, the rest of it is all unknown.
Yeah, it's also kind of interesting because, like it feels like there shouldn't be that much more for it to reveal, but I'm sure there is. So yeah, I'm definitely on board if I can to read the rest of it. Yeah,
but yeah, I really love this. I was honestly a bit trepidatious about, if that's a word. I was worried about picking it because I thought, am I holding the original novella in high esteem? Am I just gonna be a fanboy who's let down because I bigged it up in my head? But yeah, just the sheer. I mean, you can see why Go Tanabe won an Eisner for the previous Lovecraft work, because it looks stonking amazing. But yeah, the use of dark shade and colors, and Yeah, it looks ridiculous. Also, very bad doggos. Those dogs are terrifying. Holy shit. Like, goddamn. But yeah, really fascinating. Loved it to death. Well worth the price of admission. As I say, if you want to luxuriate fully into it, maybe worth picking up the physical version just so you can have the, 250-ish page doorstop.
Yeah. I mean, it certainly felt like it lends itself well to that format. But yeah, I'm somebody who tends to enjoy this specific kind of story. Like, even as somebody who's not really like a horror guy in any shape or form, like, this is the kind of thing that I like, and this is a very good example of this done well. Yeah,
I think it really works well. I Lovecraft nerd alert, but I almost hope that they do an adaptation of The Colour Out of Space, which is one of his medium-sized novellas, which I absolutely adore. I love that story. And it's also like vomit-inducingly awful and tense. So I'd love to see that in manga form so I can feel gross all over again, like I did when I read it the first time. Oh, God, that story. Anyway, so that's H.P. Lovecraft's At the Mountains of Madness. It's complete at 2 volumes. You can buy it physically or digitally. Have at. So, moving on, another very fascinating series that, Andy, you picked, go ahead, please. Take it away.
Yes. So, my pick for this show is Volume 1 of Heavenly Delusion, which is a series written by Masakazu Ishiguro, who previously wrote And Yet the Town Moves, an Elliot Page favourite.
One of my favourite manga of all time, not even joking, not overdoing it, like, seriously.
Yeah, who is an author who is kind of better known for sci-fi, I believe, over and above, And Yet the Town Moves. And this is kind of a return, I guess, to his more kind of traditional storytelling works. This is published by Dempa Books, so if you're in the UK in particular, it's only available on Kobo. Currently only Volume 1 is available in English, which, I mean, I'm tearing my hair out about as we speak, because I really need to read more of this. There are 3 volumes out in Japan, apparently. And so, Heavenly Delusion starts out with a group of kids who are clearly in this sort of futuristic kind of enclosed space that is sort of a weird sort of enclosure that is like seemingly part hospital, part school, part kind of like creche for these kind of teenagers, basically. And it kind of introduces these various characters. And one of the characters in particular is a young man called Tokyo, who during a random kind of pop quiz set by their kind of robot teacher, it's a 10-question quiz, but he sees on his screen a question 11 that asks, do you want to go outside of what's outside? Which of course is kind of gets him thinking, because that's kind of a weird thing to ask on a quiz, especially when it disappears as soon as he kind of actually clocks it. And it does get him thinking, like, what is outside the walls of this place, which is seemingly the only place that he knows. And it kind of, as this volume goes on, it's kind of revealed that all of these kids seem to have various powers of various stripes. They have some kind of, like, supernatural abilities, of various types. And so with that set up on one side of things, we then actually get to see what is outside. And that is a post-apocalyptic wasteland like Japan, and seemingly the world has been laid to waste by something that is referred to later on as the Fall, in perhaps one of the most kind of cliched names for an apocalypse ever. Basically everything is a wasteland. Like, it seems like the vast majority of humanity has died out. It seems that anybody who did kind of die in whatever the immediate apocalypse was basically just starved to death in the in kind of everything that followed, as just everything ground to a halt. But we kind of join a journey through this post-apocalyptic wasteland with a couple of characters. There is Maru and a girl who he refers to as his sister, but actually turns out isn't, called Kiloko. And they're basically just kind of wandering around, for the most part, just kind of trying to get by and survive, just kind of scavenging for food and so on and so forth. But they are also searching for quote-unquote heaven. Basically, Kiloko has kind of taken on looking after Maru as part of some kind of mission that effectively she accepted to search for heaven, and she doesn't really know what that is or what that entails. Later on, kind of Maru reveals a little bit more about what he knows about kind of the expectations upon him. And a lot of this volume is just kind of their journey. You know, they meet various bandits. They come across this kind of this organization who are basically basically just kind of growing vegetables and just trying to be self-sufficient, and they seem kind of nice enough. But they carry on moving through this world, whilst we occasionally kind of skip back to these other kids who are within these walls, and there is kind of, seeds are beginning to be sown of a desire to get out and to see actually what is going on beyond the four walls that they're kind of effectively trapped in. And I really, really like it. Like, the main thing I think that makes this series work for me is it has a really fantastic kind of atmosphere to it. Like, there's something about both kind of the internal kind of group of kids who are basically, just kind of being looked after for whatever reason, and then also these two characters roving through this wasteland that just has a real kind of good vibe to it. Like, there is something about it that just makes it really compelling, and you just want to see kind of more and more of it, which I think is helped by the fact that this is very much a series that it always shows things and rarely tells. Like, there is virtually no actual kind of exposition within this series. There are one or two kind of minor little kind of things that characters say that maybe feel a little bit outside of normal conversation to clue you in on one or two things. But for the most part, everything that you kind of learn organically just by watching what the characters are doing, why they're doing them, etc., etc.
Yeah, it's blissfully free of the, as you know, I am your brother school of exposition.
Yeah, like everything that comes about just comes about as part of a conversation or something that's going on, and even like there's a weapon within this volume that Kiliko has kind of happened upon and basically come into possession of, and like the properties of that kind of are revealed bit by bit over the volume in really pleasing ways, because you're never told like, oh yeah, this is my insert gun name here, let me explain how it works. It's just like, the process of her using it and owning it tells you everything you need to know about the weapon and its limitations and what it is good at and what it is not good at, and and that is kind of a really good sort of that is a really good kind of point for everything that this volume does, because that is pretty much every part of this world is built up in that way, and it's incredibly enjoyable to watch that happen. And I guess kind of I feel like this series takes some of the best parts of a bunch of other series that I like in a way. Like, there are parts of it that remind me of the manga in particular from the New World. Like, there is this feeling where you've got this group of kids who have clearly had a lot kept from them about what is going on in the wider world, and they, slowly get a desire to do that. There's also an interesting kind of sexual element to that as well. Like, all these teenagers are clearly kind of going through puberty and kind of getting interested in the opposite sex, and there are some just kind of almost throwaway little moments that just totally make sense within this kind of group of characters that are all very insular, of just kind of like testing the boundaries of their kind of sexuality, etc., etc. That again also kind of reminds me of a slightly more low-key version of the From the New World manga.
Not as drenched in Yuri out of nowhere, I guess.
Yeah, not quite as much. There's also obviously a little bit of a kind of early Promised Neverland feel of just like, hey, there's this, there are these walls around us. We're told that it's for our own good, and it's told by the director of this kind of organization that is keeping these kids that like it's hell outside. There is nothing but kind of beasts out there. You don't want to even think about kind of leaving where you're at right now. And so again, there's that kind of feeling as well. And then in terms of just kind of wandering through this wasteland, there's kind of a little bit more of a sort of a more peril-filled kind of Girls' Last Tour feel to it, where it's just kind of enjoyable just watching Malu and Kiliko just kind of going through this world where it's really interesting, because it's not just your typical kind of, I guess, quote unquote lazy apocalyptic wasteland where it's just like, no, everything's broken, everyone's just fending for themselves. Like, there are people still here running businesses or kind of, running communes and trying to kind of reorganize and to kind of bring about some semblance of order in this absolute chaos, sometimes with other ends in mind perhaps than is initially kind of initially show their face. But like, there's a feeling that it feels very real and lived in, that it's not just a case of like, oh, well, everything's screwed, so we're all just gonna like pick up weapons and shoot at each other. Like, there are very clear efforts from individuals or small groups to kind of convene and try and bring a semblance of order, at least to their own little bit of the world, even if the rest of the world is still in chaos. And all of that stuff kind of melds together in a really interesting way.
Yeah, on that note, I think the most interesting part, or the most well-paced, like, a lot of this series I could basically point to and say, that's a really smart way of doing it. I love it. It doesn't feel the need to, and in particular Maru and Kiriko don't feel the need to, like, they don't find somewhere and then investigate it fully. They don't feel the constant need to unearth the secret truth of where we have found ourselves. It's much more realistic, where they're on a journey. Sometimes things happen to them, like get ambushed by bandits. There's some really nice comedy elements that are very reminiscent of While the Town Turns, which, it pitches perfectly. The characters, there's no outright sort of like mush-us twirly villains. There's no pure people in it, and they're all very fascinating and interesting characters, especially the bandits. But there's no need for the characters to like unearth the secret truth of everywhere they go. They come along, like they meet some bandits, they nearly get killed, they go through that, they meet a commune, there's hints and discussion about how it might not be on the up and up and there might be something weird going on here, but then they leave. There's no need to like Bioware RPG every last place they go. I mean, where this, towards the end of this volume, you have a rather scary sort of element with this place, like, with like an inn they're staying in. But equally, it's all very sort of carefully placed and pitched to make sense in the scope of the world and make sense for the characters. And it all kind of like, it's all there for a reason, and it's not there to over-explain everything to you, and never feels the need to constantly sort of just bash you over the head with it, which is, as you mentioned, like, one of the joys of this world and these characters is the way that they nestle within the exposition. And, you have the kids on the inside who feel like Professor Xavier's School for Gifted Children crossed with Logan's Run or something. And, they know they have it good, and, we know as the audience that they have it good because they're on the inside, but also there's other stuff going on. There is forces outside their little pen. There's the kids themselves, as mentioned, they're kind of going through a lot of weird puberty, but living a very sterile life. So, two of them blow up at each other over the possession of a drawing because they don't quite know how to vocalize what they're going through or even why they're there. And there's a lot of, characters who are kind of have different motives, but it's not quite, you mentioned Promised Neverland, but it doesn't quite have the single, laser pointed focus that Promised Neverland did of, we got to get out of here. Whereas this is a lot more a case of, well, God knows what's going on here, which makes it a lot more fascinating because, I love While the Town Turns, but this manga is a lot more interesting and serious from the get-go because, even in the first chapter, you're like, damn, there's 4 times the cast in this series, but they all feel different and they all feel fleshed out. And it doesn't feel the need to just dump a bunch of character traits on you and make you dig through them. It rolls it out very carefully, and it has some really fascinating stuff. Like the end of the volume ends on a really interesting character discussion, which, I'm really interested to see how it pulls it off. I really hope that Ishiguro pulls it off well, because if that is handled badly, that would really suck, given Kiriko. But yeah, it's a really fascinating story, and as you mentioned, it has bits from loads of other series, but also just knows how to pitch itself with, as mentioned, the comedy and the sort of the weird wry humor of living in an empty world. Because you mentioned chaos, and I would maybe push back on that and say it's mostly just that there isn't anything. There isn't a government agency running around cleaning it up. There's just nothing. Stuff just fell apart. People aren't there anymore.
Yeah. And there's a really fascinating kind of stripe that runs through that side as well, where, again, kind of Mallet and Killiko meeting those bandits, and there's clear reference to, again, a great little bit of world building where there's a reference to these kids are clearly just been brought up in this apocalypse. They didn't just fall into it like we did. It's kind of like a sort of boomers v millennials kind of thing in the apocalypse, which is just a great bit of world building because it just tells you okay, this is not a thing that happened a year ago. This is a thing that has been a problem for a while, but it also, there's this really interesting kind of, social politics of just there is a generation of kids within this world that have only ever known this wasteland and are kind of hardened to it in a way that the older generation who, were used to kind of, the luxuries of a normal, capitalist lifestyle, who are now having to scavenge, they have a very different perspective on things. And again, it's just it's a throwaway kind of panel really, but it is just so interesting in itself, just that little point that kind of, brings so much life to that world and kind of makes you think about a whole lot of what is going on within it.
Yeah, it's a really weird, really interesting bit of generational warfare. Like, several times during this, characters will view Kiriko and Maru and will say, you grew up post-collapse. Oh, I bet your morals are all fucked up. And they're like, why are you saying this to us? Like, this is rude. Which is really fascinating, honestly, because you can see that, like, when they come to the commune. When they come to the commune people are like, we found ourselves free, and so we decided to make something, and there's something off about that lot. But as I say, I was really glad when they just moved past it. They didn't feel the need to dig into it, because I was waiting for the like annoying garbage post-apocalyptic storyline of they're cannibals, dun dun dun, because that's in every fucking story, and I hate it. It's boring.
You would. I was fully expecting like, there's going to be like a volume of this where they're all nice, and then suddenly they're getting stuck in a basement or something, and they've got to find their way out. They've got to escape from these crazy people, and it's like, no, it's just like they're just a commune. Yeah, there's definitely something a bit off and weird there, but also they seem nice enough, and we just need to move on and do our thing. And yeah, that's kind of enjoyably refreshing that it doesn't feel like it needs to micromanage every little bit of this world that gets encountered.
Well, it knows not to make it more boring, which is the danger with this stuff. Is over explaining stuff can make it boring. You don't need to explain everything. And and the characters, there's a great, like, as I say, I really love the characters because there's a huge breadth of them, and they're fascinating. Like, both Maru and Kiriko's deal are really fascinating, just as a pair, because we mostly focus on them and their travails. Like, it's a really fascinating thing, and these two storylines will collide at some point, but God knows. But it's really fascinating. It's a really lovely read. And to extend that, I also just really enjoy the interactions between the characters, like particularly those who are kind of who are part of Professor Xavier's compound, because like, so many series tend to give you like a group of like, say, like half a dozen characters and just pair them up like 2 and 2 and 2 and just like, okay, there you go, that's it. And maybe have like a love triangle somewhere here and there. But there's a real kind of nice complexity to the way all of those characters interact with each other. Like, they all, as you would when you were all kind of in this very kind of relatively enclosed space, like, they all have relationships with one another. Like, it's not cliquey. There are not small groups. Kind of, they all have their own kind of, their own deals with each other. And again, that just makes everything feel very kind of real and fleshed out, because it just feels very natural that all of these characters are interacting with each other, and they all kind of have slightly different ways of talking to each other, depending on who they're talking to at any given moment in time. And all of that stuff just feels very kind of rich. Yeah, one thing you mentioned that, again, I'm going to sound like a dum-dum here, but when you mentioned that they all had different powers, I'd known that they were all strange or interesting characters, but I didn't directly ascribe the fact that they have different abilities, which they kind of do. Like, the one who's constantly drawing clearly is able to, like, because they talk to him saying, draw us another picture of what you see in your head. And he clearly has some kind of weird power going on there, but as I mentioned, they don't overburden it. They don't say, you're all special children, you all have powers, your power is this, your power is this. It's more just like a bunch of kids in Logan's Run at Professor Xavier School. And it doesn't ever feel the need to tell you that. Whereas us talking about it now, I'm like, oh yeah, they all have a weird little thing going on. Wow.
Well, it's like, even the first time that gets introduced with like a kid that just like, bounds ridiculously high, there was kind of that moment of like, is this just manga being manga, or is this actually like, a thing? And then clearly as time goes on, you start to realize like, oh no, okay, all of these kids like, have something above and beyond normal kind of, human ability. And, it doesn't feel the need to, again, like this in any other series probably would be a long kind of exposition dump of like, well, as these children that we are looking after, are all et cetera, and would feel the need to kind of hammer that home to you. But it doesn't. It just lets you figure that out for yourself. And once you see kind of, more and more characters just doing a thing that is slightly outside of the norm of kind of human bounds, you're like, oh, okay, I guess that's their thing. And yeah, it's really pleasing. And it kind of, it makes you feel smart in a weird kind of way, because you're not being talked to and talked at. Like, you're just an observer of this, and you're being allowed to kind of like let the story build in your own mind rather than you having it all kind of spooled out to you.
Well, it makes it a lot more exciting and interesting just as a reader, because instead of it being like, here are 10 characters and here are their powers, it's more a case of, I'm sat there reading it thinking, man, what the hell happens next? Like, these characters are all fascinating, but I don't know what their deal is, and I don't quite know what their scope is. Whereas if you're just told all their powers, you then spend God knows how long just like planning it out and future and coming up with the idea. Like, you start to pre-game it almost. And so having it be a mystery is much more interesting, unsurprisingly.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the final thing that I'll come back to is, just reiterating your point about the comedy that I didn't mention, because, like, it has a really good vein of, some of it is just plain slapstick. There's a lot of, like you say, really good kind of gallows humor and one-liners and quips, but, like, they're always well-placed. They're always in just the right place and in just the right moments to kind of, either alleviate a bit of tension or accentuate something that's happening. Like, it never feels out of place or forced, because, again, like, having read bits or seen the anime and yet the town moves, like, I thought, maybe it's just going to shoehorn a bunch of, like, dumb jokes into places where it doesn't belong, but it's very measured at knowing when to do a bit of comedy and when to keep a straight face, and it does such a good job of that it's really commendable on that front as well.
Yeah, it reminded me of the town moves, because the bandits remind me of the, like, idiot other store owners in the shopping arcade. Like, they almost seem like they have the same idiot goonery amongst each other, even when they've got someone pointing a gun at them. So that was really good fun. But yeah, it knows when to cut the tension, and it knows when to keep the tension going. Like, as I say, at the end of volume sort of reveal, pseudo reveal is really fascinating. It's like, oh, okay, blimey, this is playing with very intense fire, so let's see what happens. There is so much. I mean, again, as I mentioned kind of up top, like, I'm jonesing to get my hands on volume 2, because there is so much stuff set up here that I want to see above and beyond just the general kind of, like, I want to see more of this world and kind of, fill in some more of the gaps. But I really want to see kind of, what is going on with these characters. Like, at what point are these two kind of currently disparate stories going to intersect? And there is a lot for me to be excited about in terms of reading more of this. So I'm really hoping we get more of it sooner rather than later. Yeah, especially given that, like, for an entire half of these set of characters, like the characters in the Professor Xavier school, like, we don't actually know what they really want, or they don't really have anything, like any inciting incident yet. So I have no idea what's going to happen with them, or if anything's going to happen to them, or they're going to cause something. Like, it's fascinating. I can't wait. Which makes waiting for it a pain in the bum. Did you read this digitally or physically, by the way?
I read this digitally, so I picked this up on Kobo.
Yeah, same. One thing this is me kind of nitpicking, but I noticed that in Kobo, at least on my app, it listed the author as Masakazu Chavez Ishiguro. It shoved Ed Chavez's name in the middle, which might make searching for it a bit weird.
Like, I wasn't sure if there's some kind of, like, marriage of convenience that we need to know about going on there, or what it is. I'm just going to ascribe that to some weird data entry error, but who knows? Let the conspiracy theories begin here.
Having talked to people who have had to work with e-book store backends, I'm willing to bet it's more just a metadata is awkward at times problem.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I've seen that before. So, but yeah, I really love this series. I was, again, not to be too much of a baby about it again, and I feel like I say this every week at this point, but I was really scared because I love And the Town Moves so much. Like, it's one of my favorite things. And I was like, oh, I really hope this isn't the case where the author then eats shit on their follow-up series, even if it's not the same thing. But no, it's great. I love it. Good shit.
Awesome. We picked some good ones this time.
Oh, God. You're saying that as a lead into the next section, aren't you? So, what we're talking about next episode. This is where I also complain and say that Andy kind of stole my suggestion, but I was hoping to do it later and also when the heat was off. So, whatever. So I've picked the first volume of Chio's School Road, which I've read before, actually. I actually have a copy of the Japanese edition somewhere in this flat, which I don't know why I bought the damn thing. I can't read it, but this is now coming out legally and had an anime and all, so we'll get to read that. And Andy, how about you? Yeah,
so because I welcome the heat, and in in the frame of true journalistic endeavour, there's been a lot of controversy in the week of recording this around the anime adaptation of Interspecies Reviewers, which has been cancelled from Funimation streaming service. It's been cancelled on a Japanese TV channel for being too lewd, basically. And so I figured, for our own journalistic integrity, we should investigate the source material, and thus I have chosen Volume 1 of Interspecies Reviewers. I'm so sorry, everybody.
So, as a shameful admission, I've already read the first volume of this and was planning to jump it on you at some point, but now I don't feel guilty whatsoever. So screw you, Andy. Why are you doing this to me?
Yeah, I'm just doing it to myself at this point. But I mean, in fairness, like from what I've read around this series, like I've also read a lot of interesting discourse around it that has kind of made me curious to see exactly, where it sits on the spectrum of such things as well. So I am actually genuinely interested in it, as well as the kind of journalistic prurience of it all.
No, yeah, I would say that there's a lot to talk about in this series, and it's interesting. And if nothing else, I am glad it exists and it's getting its time to shine. And also, frankly, although I have not watched the anime goes way beyond the manga, which is apparently part of the reason why it kind of got pulled. As a quick update and amusing note, now it's been pulled off of Japanese television, or at least on one TV channel, it got replaced with an Oceanside Cruise, which is, I think, almost the same stopgap programming that happened with School Days when it got delayed a week. So
yeah. I'd like to think that's a very deliberate kind of in-joke on their part, but who knows?
I think it's just the first thing they've got that's like the single most inoffensive midnight programming is, fuck it, show on the nice boat. So
yeah, that's
yeah, God. Talk about piece of internet history I was there to see was the original Nice Boat post.
Yeah, everything comes around again eventually, I guess.
Time is a flat circle. So, thank you very much for listening. We kind of went a bit long, but I think this is a good one. So, thank you very much for listening. You can find this and all the other podcasts at our website, screentone.club. If you like this podcast, please consider telling a friend. Word of mouth is still the best way for podcasts to spread and get new listeners. As mentioned at the top, we have a Patreon. Please, if you enjoyed this, consider putting in $1 or $3. If you choose the $3 tier, you get to vote on what we cover in the bonus episodes, which by the time this comes out, we will have selected our next title we're going to look for in our monthly bonus. I'll let you know on the internets once we pick that next week. Next week from the time of... Oh, God, time's hard. Anyway, you'll know by the time this comes out. You can also find us on Twitter at Screentone Club. You can also send us an email at show@screentone.club. My name's Elliot Page, and you can find me at Elliot Page on Twitter, talking about politics again. Someone stop me. And my lovely co-host, Mr. Andy Hanley. Where can people find you, Andy?
Yes, you can find me on Twitter at Hannes1979, and who knows what I'll be talking about. Probably not the Interspecies Reviewers anime, though, so you're safe on that.
No, I must admit, a Discord channel I follow removed their Interspecies Reviewers channel because it was no longer being shown, and the people who were in there were really bummed because they were really jonesing for that series. I probably shouldn't call them out on here. I'll delete this. But no, thank you very much for listening, and good night.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.